Hello, class. This is Amadiah Brown, and I will now be presenting my final project for World Literature Studies with Professor Karen Kaiser. I want to start off with a quote that I found in the Postcolonial Studies Reader that I thought was a good definition of postcolonial theory. Quote, discussions about experience of various kinds, migration, slavery, suppression, resistance, representation, difference, race, gender, place, and responses to the influential master discourse of imperial Europe, such as history, philosophy, and linguistics, and the fundamental experiences of speak and writing by which all these come into being. Okay, so we'll get started with the summary of postcolonial theory. When analyzing postcolonial theory in literature, the reader is looking for how the story connects to the particular time period in which it was written. The subject discussed is the colonial era, when the European countries first began to explore and expand into other areas of the world. This was a time of economic growth, and plenty of profit and power were being gained through exploitation of people and resources. It was not always soldier against soldier, because the dominant military of the colonizing nation fought against the civilians as well. So it wasn't really a fair fight. As a result, the natives of the countries that were being colonized were sometimes driven into slavery. These nations were being oppressed from many viewpoints, including political, cultural, and psychological. When the term postcolonial was originally used by historians after World War II, it just had a chronological meaning. Eventually, as they began studying the actual effects of colonization, historians and literary critics began using the term in many literary pieces for discussion. When trying to understand a literary work and how it relates to postcolonial theory, some critical theorists believe it is logical to try to understand the author first. Where does he come from? What are his beliefs and values? These help theorists understand the way the author's life experiences affect their literary work, and if there is a real meaning in between the lines. The stories that were told during these times were told in a way that grabbed the reader's attention. Debate would soon follow, and now real topics that affect or affected people's lives are being discussed and possibly addressed. Every literary piece, from authors who were in a position of power to authors who were in the group being colonized, should be considered when interpreting postcolonial theory. A good example of someone who was influential in postcolonial studies was Frantz Fanon, who wrote The Wretched of the Earth. It was written to help encourage the oppressed people stand up against violence and unfair treatment. He wrote, quote, and it is clear that in the colonial countries, the peasants alone are revolutionary, for they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. The themes of postcolonial theory used in literature are analyzed because they address how the colonization took place. The postcolonial themes include, but are not limited to, identity, race, gender, class, language, oppression, suppression, hybridity, power, imperialism, and being civilized or uncivilized. Each theme has its own function when analyzing postcolonial literature. Identity of the colonized people plays a huge part. The way the colonizing power sees them becomes the way they see themselves. The identity they once had soon becomes an object of shame and embarrassment. Once that happens, traditions they were once proud to pass on and share with their children disappear forever, because they were never taught to them, and the traditions die with the elders. Identity and its effects is the most important theme in my opinion, because as humans we need to be comfortable with ourselves and have some kind of understanding of our origin before moving forward in a positive way when all is said and done. My reflection on all the stories that we read. Postcolonial theory in the Epic of Gilgamesh was displayed with the use of many of the aforementioned themes. The one that showed up the most of the time in a lot of texts was identity. Gilgamesh, while very aware of who he was supposed to be, did not know who he actually was. He thought he was immortal because of his position in life at the time. After identifying and relating to his equal and his friend Enkidu, he was slowly forced to accept the realization of his mortality. Being civilized or uncivilized was an obvious theme for this story because the other, being Enkidu, was described as being uncivilized in his introduction, but his disposition would change to civilized at the conclusion. The colonizers, Gilgamesh and others, introduced their beliefs and values onto the colonized Enkidu, placing him into the widely accepted status of us and no longer other. Power came into play with the dynamic of friendship and the power over Uruk's citizens. Also, the fact that Gilgamesh was considered to be in a class by himself above all others in his kingdom suggests that he was the colonizer of everyone below him, which would fall under oppression. Race could be interpreted as a theme in this story as well. Though there is no description of color, as we mostly use today, Enkidu may have been considered something that did not belong to the human race and therefore an outsider. The story does show some effects of postcolonial theory as the colonizer changes his path of life because of the colonized and his influence. William Shakespeare's The Tempest supports many themes of the postcolonial theory, much like Gilgamesh does with power, identity, race, oppression, suppression, class, gender, hybridity, language, imperialism, being civilized or uncivilized. An example of each of these themes can be extracted from the story in one way or another. Just to point out a few, language was a tool used by the colonizers, Prospero and Miranda, to teach and communicate with the colonized, Caliban. Although the reasoning behind teaching language was done with good intentions, the colonizer does not consider the fact that the colonized does not want to be taught their language because he was happy with his own. Gender comes into play with Miranda, being the opposite of Prospero and his infinite imperialism and power. Hybridity through Caliban and his mixture of cultures is seen throughout the tale. The class theme is displayed as well because of the king, his brother under him, the jester, and sailors under the brother, and so on. The colonizer chooses to change his path, much like Gilgamesh did in Epic of Gilgamesh. The author may have been thinking optimistically when writing the play, in hopes that life would imitate art. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness gives the analyst plenty to talk about in relation to the postcolonial theory. Much like the other two stories, it touches on each of the postcolonial themes in some way through the words of the narrator/author. The power, imperialism, oppression, and so on and so forth dynamic with the Belgians and the Congolese in Heart of Darkness is a primary example of colonization and how the effects remain a factor. Class as a theme is noticed with the passengers and the laborers on board the steamboat making the journey. One of the more obvious themes is the quote-unquote savages being influenced to become civilized by the European traders. The colonizers may have originally had good intentions, but in the story, their intentions lead more toward industry and profit from the African resources. The identity of Mr. Kurtz was in question with his actions after attempting to bring civilization to the uncivilized natives. He ended up being consumed by the environment and adapting to the very customs he was trying to change as a colonizer. The idea of this turn of events seems like the opposite effect of the original plan, unmasking another negative facet of colonialism. The short story I read, A Hanging, by George Orwell, is an anecdote that the author says he experienced during his stint as a British Imperial Police in Burma, India. As far as postcolonial theory goes, the theme of power is present as well as identity. Obviously, since the setting of the story is in a prison, power is needed and it's what holds the organization together. The constant tug of war between the us and the other, the prisoner and the authority, is a never-ending cycle and becomes a way of everyday life. The author may have been using this piece to speak out against the death penalty, which is always a controversial subject. To reinforce his emotions, he starts the story with a descriptive account of the weather. It was in Burma, a sodden morning of the rains. A sickly light, like yellow tinfoil, was slanting over the high walls into the jail yard. The very first line gives the reader a picture of a dismal and gloomy environment. The author uses the theme of identity as he describes how he notices the prisoner stepping to the side to avoid a puddle. Before the prisoner did this, he was considered just another job that was coming to an end very shortly. Afterwards, the prisoner was seen as human, and he could now identify with him. Quote, when I saw the prisoner step aside to avoid the puddle, I saw the mystery, the unspeakable wrongness of cutting life short when it is in full tide. This man was not dying. He was alive, just as we were alive. My analysis. I would say the short story best serves as an example of literature as mediation. The one I just went over, hanging. It could be considered a political platform and used to address his disagreement with the capital punishment. A percentage of people agree that this form of punishment violates a person's civil liberties, and regardless of the crime committed, they should be allowed to live out the rest of their lives in prison. A percentage of people would likely disagree with this notion because of an argument that in some correction systems, the people who pay towards the government are in some way paying for the incarcerated criminals to thrive and enjoy life, while their victims are likely unable to do the same. This literary piece addresses the message honestly by basing it on real circumstances, but indirectly because it's not a focused attack on the system. The author expresses his opposition to what is taking place in front of him by casually pointing out the things that make the prisoner human-like, his muscles, his hair, and his health. It reinforces the idea that a human life is being legally extinguished. My recommendation? Shakespeare's The Tempest. This is a literary piece that is least useful as an example of literature's mediation. Because the story, while it touches on many different post-colonial themes and ideas, is geared towards entertainment more than anything political. Some may argue that Shakespeare uses his plays as a platform to address his views to the public. I would argue that this play was written to entertain the masses with a storyline that involves magic and self-absorbed heroes. The characters in the story did what most people in their respective positions would. For example, Alonso banished his brother from dukedom because he felt threatened by him. Prospero seeks revenge for being exiled and tried to make him suffer for it. The indicators of post-colonialism are present, but more in a satirical approach in general manner than anything political. So there you have it. That's the end of my final project. I hope you enjoyed. Take care.